early 1900s, northeast Thailand. According to accounts from the tradition, a young monk named Mun walks into a forest clearing at midnight. In the center, a corpse, 3 days dead, bloated, rotting in the heat. He sits down 2 meters away, close enough to smell it, and he begins to meditate. Not on peace, not on compassion, not on emptiness. On this, the inevitability that his own body, the body sitting there right now, will look exactly like this. He stays there all night, watching the decay, watching the insects, watching what the dogs do at dawn. This wasn't trauma, this was training. By the early 1900s, Buddhism in Thailand had become comfortable. Monks lived in temples, chanted scriptures, performed ceremonies for villagers, received donations. Safe, respectable, organized. But a small group of monks asked a dangerous question. Is this what the Buddha actually did? The answer led them to abandon everything: the temples, the robes made from new cloth, the beds, the security. They walked into tiger-infested jungles, slept under trees, meditated in cemeteries, and they claimed to discover what institutional Buddhism had forgotten: that you cannot loosen death's grip until you've stopped looking away from it. This is the Thai Forest tradition, the renegade movement that shocked the Buddhist establishment and quietly became one of the most influential practices in modern Buddhism. Not mastered death by defeating it, mastered by ending denial. To understand why monks would choose to meditate with corpses, you need to understand what Thai Buddhism had become. By the 1890s, the Sangha, the monastic order, had become institutionalized, connected to royal patronage. Monks served primarily as ritual specialists, merit-making for lay people. Their days filled with ceremony, chanting, scripture study. Monasteries offered comfort, regular meals, shelter, social status. Buddhism had become a vocation rather than a transformation. But Theravada Buddhism claims a particular authenticity. We covered this in our video on the 3 schools of Buddhism. Theravada presents itself as the tradition that preserves the Buddha's original teachings, the Pali Canon, the Vinaya, the oldest recorded words. Yet the Buddha wandered homeless, meditated in forests, practiced extreme austerities for 6 years before his enlightenment, lived on 1 meal a day. The disconnect became impossible to ignore. Think of mountaineers debating alpine style versus expedition climbing. Both reach the summit, but only one claims purity of approach. Thai Buddhism faced the same question: can you reach enlightenment from a comfortable monastery? Or do you need to risk everything, like the Buddha did? Two monks began asking these questions seriously. Ajahn Mun the Elder, a quiet, unassuming practitioner who meditated in the forests of northeast Thailand. He didn't write books, didn't seek students. He practiced, sometimes for months, without speaking to anyone. His student Ajahn Mun possessed different qualities: more driven, more willing to challenge established norms, more convinced that something essential had been lost. Together, they read the Vinaya, the monastic code, with fresh eyes. They studied the early suttas, and they found the Dhutaṅga practices, 13 optional ascetic observances the Buddha himself praised. The texts treat these practices as direct support for dispassion and letting go, not optional benefits, pathways. These weren't historical curiosities, these were active instructions. Around 1893, Ajahn Mun stood in his monastery room at dawn. Outside, he could hear the morning chants, familiar, safe, the life he knew. He picked up his bowl, left his few possessions behind, walked to the forest edge, and never returned to monastic comfort. Years later, a senior monk asked why he'd abandoned a promising position. Mun answered simply, "I wanted to practice what we preach." What he discovered in those forests would challenge everything Thai Buddhism assumed about the path to enlightenment. The Buddha didn't teach meditation alone, he taught a way of life. Dhutaṅga are optional ascetic disciplines, tools, not commandments, used to sand down attachment. By the 1900s, mainstream Thai Buddhism considered these practices extreme, perhaps unsuitable for modern practitioners, relics of a harsher time. The forest monks disagreed. They saw these as training methods that comfort tends to push aside. The Vinaya lists 13 Dhutaṅga practices, 3 proved most radical. First, wearing robes made from discarded cloth. Pamsukalika, the rag robe practice. Refusing new cloth from donors. Collecting funeral shrouds, rags from trash heaps, washing them in rivers, sewing them by hand. This destroys pride at its root. Your robe was once wrapped around a corpse. What is there to be proud of? Second, eating only from the alms bowl once a day. Pindapatika, the alms food practice. Walking through villages at dawn, bowl extended, taking whatever villagers offered, rice, scraps, sometimes nothing. That became your meal. Once, for the entire day. Not choosing food, not eating afternoon, not storing anything for tomorrow. Why? Breaking attachment to pleasure, recognizing that survival itself depends entirely on others' generosity. You own nothing, not even your next meal. Ajahn Mun once went 7 days eating only boiled rice water, not because of famine, because that's what appeared in his bowl. He said later, "On the 7th day, I understood clearly. The mind that craves the taste of curry and the mind that achieves jhana, these are enemies." And villagers didn't only fear these forest monks, many loved them because a monk who wants nothing can't be bought. People trusted them because nothing about them felt performative. Third, sleeping wherever night falls. Rukamulika, the tree root practice. The Majjhima Nikaya describes the Buddha dwelling at the root of trees during his years of wandering practice, not returning to a monastery, under trees in caves and cemeteries, exposed to weather, to animals, to danger. Ajahn Mun once woke under a tree to find a cobra coiled 2 feet from his head. He didn't move. If I'm attached to this body, he thought, I haven't understood anything. The snake eventually left. The third practice meant accepting death as a constant companion. No security, no shelter, no home. The forest monks took this literally. In 2015, a man named Kyle Maynard, born without arms or legs, crawled on his hands and knees up Mount Kilimanjaro. No prosthetics, his body alone. Someone asked why. He said, "Because I wanted to know what I was capable of." The forest monks asked the same question about the mind, not what's the easiest path to enlightenment, but what am I actually capable of? In forest lineages, you hear the same confession again and again. Some nights in the forest, I wondered if I was doing this right, or torturing myself. Mun's response, That doubt is part of the practice too. Keep sitting. And then there was the 13th practice, the one that separated the forest monks from everyone else. Sosanika, the charnel-ground practice. While other monks debated scripture in comfortable monasteries, Ajahn Mun sat in a charnel ground as the sun set, a corpse to his left. Tigers in the darkness ahead, his mind raw from 12 hours of meditation. No escape, no comfort, no negotiation. The Buddha had said, "Go to the charnel ground and contemplate the corpse." The Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, states explicitly, "Again, monks, as if he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, 1 day dead, 2 days dead, 3 days dead, bloated, livid, and festering, he applies it to this same body thus. This body too is of the same nature. It will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate." This wasn't metaphor, this was instruction. Mun went, because he understood what many contemporary Buddhist practitioners have forgotten. You can't transform what you refuse to see. In a lot of modern wellness Buddhism, we sanitize death. We discuss impermanence as philosophy, an abstract concept to contemplate during meditation retreats. The forest monks made it visceral. The practice of asubha bhavana, contemplation of the unbeautiful, finding recently deceased bodies, cremation grounds, cemeteries, sitting with them. The Satipatthana Sutta describes stages of decay. The practitioner observes bloating, discoloration, being devoured by animals, bones scattering, eventual dissolution to dust. Each stage studied, witnessed, internalized, not to become morbid, to see clearly. Another practice, contemplation of the 32 parts of the body. The Kayagata-sati Sutta lists them. Kesa, hair. Loma, body hair. Nakha, nails. Danta, teeth. Tako, skin. Then deeper, organs, blood, bile. The practitioner contemplates each part systematically until the illusion of the body as beautiful or mine dissolves. This is not me, this is not mine. But why does this produce transformation? Death contemplation doesn't aim to make you gloomy, it aims to end bargaining. The mind keeps promising itself later I'll practice seriously, later I'll change, later I'll become real. A corpse ends the illusion of later, and when later dies, craving loses its favorite hiding place. Fantasy time collapses, and with it the endless negotiation that prevents practice from becoming real. The tradition repeats one theme across many texts. Appamada, heedfulness, is the path beyond death. Not because you become immortal, but because you stop living as if you are. Imagine sitting 2 meters from a rotting corpse for an entire night. Everything in you wants to run, the smell, the sight, the primal revulsion, but you stay. When slowly observation becomes possible, the fear doesn't disappear, but it clarifies, because you're looking at your own future, directly, without metaphor. That was a person with plans, relationships, a sense of being someone, and now it's that. And I will be that. So what does that mean about how I should live right now? Hospice workers, people who sit with the dying every day, often describe a paradoxical effect. Being close to death doesn't make them depressed, it makes them more alive. One hospice nurse described it. Watching someone take their last breath makes you realize how much you've been taking your own breaths for granted. The forest monks discovered this a century ago, Confronting death doesn't create nihilism, it creates urgency. But the charnel grounds weren't the only danger. The forests themselves, tigers, cobras, other predators prowling at night. Physical danger existed, but psychological danger ran deeper. Complete isolation, no one nearby for miles. Darkness, the mind's creations, sounds in the night, branches breaking, animals moving. What's real versus imagined. The practice. Stay present. Don't run. Investigate the fear itself. Fear isn't the enemy. Unawareness is. Fear becomes fuel when you see it clearly. According to Ajahn Mahabua's biography of his teacher, Ajahn Mun once described a night in a charnel ground. He sat meditating next to a corpse as darkness fell. Hours passed, then he heard something moving, circling. In the moonlight, a tiger. 30 meters away, then 20, then 10. Every instinct screamed, "Run." He didn't. He stayed, watching the mind's reaction to terror. "I'm going to die anyway," he thought, "whether tonight or in 50 years, so why run?" The tiger circled, came close enough for Mun to hear its breathing, then left. Mun sat until dawn. Villagers found him in the morning, still sitting there, motionless, next to the corpse. He said, "That night I understood clearly. Fear of death isn't the problem. Running from that fear is." But the question remains, what did decades of this practice actually produce? What happens when you meditate 14 hours a day for 40 years in a forest? Ajahn Mun, the elder teacher, appears rarely in historical records. Almost no writings survive. No extensive teachings. Simple practice. Forest. Meditation. Silence that sometimes lasted months. His gift, creating space for others to discover what he'd found. Without needing credit. Without needing recognition. We can't reconstruct every detail of his life with certainty, but the spirit of his practice remains unmistakable in those he trained. Ajahn Mun lived differently. Born in 1870 in a small village in northeastern Thailand, ordained in 1893, he wandered for nearly 50 years across Thailand and Laos, practiced the Dhutaṅga austerities relentlessly, and his students believed the results spoke for themselves. Jhanas, deep meditative absorptions where sensory experience disappears, where the sense of self temporarily dissolves. He described these states in detail. First jhana, joy and pleasure born of seclusion. Second jhana, joy without thought. Third jhana, equanimous happiness. Fourth jhana, pure awareness beyond pleasure and pain. But his claims extended further. He spoke of teaching Dhamma to devas, gods and spirits, described detailed visions of other realms, heavens, hells, the hungry ghost realm, said he could perceive beings invisible to others, claimed knowledge of past lives. You have three options here. One, believe these claims literally. Many Thai Buddhists do. The Pali Canon describes these abilities as natural results of deep practice. 2. Dismiss them as hallucination. Many Western skeptics do. 3, and this proves most interesting, ask a different question. What was Mun experiencing? Understanding his claims requires context. Thai Buddhism didn't exist in isolation. Thailand's religious landscape included animistic beliefs, spirit houses, protective amulets, devas, and nagas. Forest monks meditated in places villagers treated with caution. Territories considered spiritually active, protected by non-human forces. So when Mun claimed to teach Dhamma to devas, Thai villagers didn't find this strange. They assumed the forests were populated by beings beyond ordinary perception. Maybe he actually perceived other realms. Maybe these were deep meditative states manifesting as vivid internal experiences. Maybe his mind, pushed to extreme limits through isolation and austere practice, began generating phenomena that felt utterly real. The question isn't, are spirits real? The question is, what happens to consciousness when you push it to the edge for decades? And on that question, Mun's accounts offer valuable first-person evidence. Whatever you believe about their ultimate nature, we can't separate practice from culture. We can't separate experience from interpretation. We've talked about Mara before. He isn't a cartoon devil. He's the mind's refusal to let go. Mun sat with that refusal every night in those forests, facing what every practitioner eventually meets, the part of consciousness that would rather fantasize than see clearly. The Bangkok Buddhist establishment didn't embrace the forest monks initially. Some criticized them as too extreme, misrepresenting Buddhism as grim and morbid, making the tradition seem harsh and unappealing. Others questioned their supernatural claims, gods, spirits. This sounded more like folk religion than Buddhism. But the forest monks had one undeniable advantage. Villagers could observe the difference. A monk who'd meditated with corpses for 20 years carried himself differently than a monk who'd spent 20 years chanting in a comfortable temple. Presence, fearlessness, equanimity, that couldn't be argued with. And what emerged after years of this austere practice? Not grimness. Students described Mun as possessing profound peace, a lightness, even humor. The training didn't make him dour. It made him free. But this raises a difficult question about who had access to this practice. Were there female forest tradition practitioners? The honest answer, very few. Thai Buddhism in the early 1900s didn't fully ordain women. The Bhikkhuna lineage had died out centuries earlier. Some women practiced as Mai Chis, lay nuns in white robes, and followed forest tradition teachings under male teachers. But the intense wandering practice, sleeping in forests, meditating in charnel grounds, Thai society considered this too dangerous for women. Whether that restriction came from Buddhism or Thai culture remains debatable. But the forest tradition preserved ancient practices and also preserved ancient limitations. Other masters emerged from this lineage. Ajahn Mahabua continued Mun's uncompromising approach, built Wat Paban Tad, became one of Thailand's most respected and feared meditation teachers. He later wrote the definitive biography of his teacher. Ajahn Chah took the tradition in a different direction, opening it to the world. We'll explore his impact shortly. What set all of them apart? They were practitioners first, scholars second, or not at all. Mun didn't write academic papers on meditation. He meditated for hours, daily, for 50 years. The credibility came from embodiment. In 1949, as Ajahn Mun lay dying, monks gathered around him. According to those present, one monk asked, "What should we do after you're gone?" Mun's answer came simply, "Practice, that's all. Don't make me into something I wasn't. I found clarity in these forests, but I didn't invent anything. I remembered what had been forgotten. If you want what I found, go where I went." He died that night, age 79. Tens of thousands attended his funeral. Villagers, monks, members of the royal family. But his real legacy was already spreading into forests across Thailand and soon into the West. Because by the 1960s, an unexpected development occurred. Westerners began arriving. In 1967, a 23-year-old American college graduate named Jack Cornfield walked into Wat Pa Pong, a forest monastery in northeastern Thailand. He later described finding monks who had meditated for 40 years in forests. They weren't scholars, they'd done the practice. And their presence, you could feel something different, a kind of clarity that couldn't be faked. He would never be the same. The post-war generation sought alternatives, disillusionment with materialism, with Vietnam, with conventional religion. Most went to India for yoga and Hindu teachings or Japan for the Zen boom. Thailand remained less famous, the forest tradition almost unknown to Westerners. Ajahn Chah changed that trajectory. A student of Ajahn Mun's lineage, he established Wat Pa Pong in 1954, maintained strict forest tradition practices, tree root dwelling, 1 meal daily, including contemplations of death. But he proved willing to accept Western students, unusual at the time. Many Thai monasteries considered Westerners unreliable, unable to handle the discipline. Chah disagreed. He said, "The Dhamma isn't Thai, it's universal. If someone wants to practice seriously, let them try." In 1975, he created Wat Pa Nanachat, the International Forest Monastery, built specifically for Western monks, first of its kind. His particular gift, making ancient practices accessible without diluting them. He could explain profound Dhamma in simple language, but he never reduced the intensity of the training. The Western students who came weren't tourists. Jack Cornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, Ajahn Sumedho, a former Peace Corps worker. They ordained as monks, shaved their heads, committed to years of training, living in the forest, eating once a day from alms rounds, meditating for hours, sleeping under mosquito nets in open-air huts. And yes, some practiced charnel-ground meditation, like Mun did. What they discovered proved transformative. The methods produced measurable results, not as philosophy, not as cultural Buddhism, as direct techniques for transforming consciousness. There's an irony here worth noticing. The forest tradition started as rejection of institutional comfortable Buddhism in Thailand, a return to stripped-down original practice. 70 years later, it became one of the major streams feeding Western Theravada practice, alongside Burmese Vipassana lineages and Sri Lankan traditions. Insight meditation centers, Vipassana retreats, Spirit Rock, Insight Meditation Society. Many of these trace directly or indirectly back to those forest monks meditating with corpses in northeast Thailand. The Renegades became mainstream. The transformation happened relatively quickly. 1960s, virtually unknown in the West. 1970s, small pioneering group of Western practitioners. 1980s, Insight Meditation Centers established in the United States and United Kingdom. 1990s to 2000s becomes one of the dominant Western Theravada approaches. 2020s, millions of practitioners worldwide have encountered teachings rooted in the forest tradition. In the late 1970s, Ajahn Chah visited England at the invitation of Western students. He brought Ajahn Sumedho, the former American-turned-Thai forest monk. Within a few years, they established Chithurst Buddhist Monastery in West Sussex, the first forest monastery in the West. Stories like this show up again and again in Western retreat accounts. A professional attends their first intensive forest tradition retreat. 10 days, sitting in silence, following the traditional schedule, rising at 4 a.m., eating once a day, long periods of walking meditation in the woods. Around day 7 or 8, something breaks. Not a breakdown, a breakthrough. Decades of running from mortality, from discomfort, from their own mind, suddenly stops. Later they describe it, for the first time I stopped negotiating with myself. They might never become monks, but they become practitioners. That's how the forest tradition spread, not through institutions alone, but through transformation. Because the practice wasn't Thai, or American, or English. It was human. The forest monks had rediscovered methods for facing what every human fears: death, isolation, the raw contents of consciousness, and that capacity for transformation translates across cultures. Which brings us to the question that matters most. What does this mean for us? An uncomfortable question emerges. Can the forest tradition survive its own success? This wasn't an attack on temple Buddhism. Temples preserve learning, ritual, community, and generosity. The forest movement questioned one thing specifically. What happens when the inner training disappears and only the outer form remains? That question applies to the forest tradition itself now. The forest tradition rejected comfort and institutionalization. Today, forest tradition monasteries have websites, published books, international teaching tours, meditation centers with online scheduling, evolution or dilution. The core practices haven't changed in serious forest monasteries. Mindfulness of body, including death contemplation, meditation on impermanence, living simply, ethically, with awareness, confronting discomfort rather than avoiding it. The question becomes, can you do this in a comfortable monastery, or do you need the actual forest? Different teachers answer differently. Some say the inner forest matters more than the outer. Others insist that real comfort destroys real practice. We can't resolve that debate here, but we can observe that the question itself remains alive. Today, forest monasteries still exist in Thailand, Laos, and the West. Some maintain the traditional intensity. Others have adapted. The question of authenticity remains contested within the tradition itself. Long-distance hikers on trails like the Appalachian often describe a similar pattern. The first week feels unbearable. Everything hurts, they want to quit. But around week 3, a shift occurs. The constant discomfort becomes normal, then paradoxically liberating. One hiker described it. You realize how much energy you spend trying to be comfortable, and when you stop fighting discomfort, you discover this incredible clarity. You don't need to meditate with corpses, but you do need to stop running from difficulty. That's what the forest monks understood. The forest tradition isn't for everyone. Not everyone can or should abandon their life and live in a forest. But the tradition asks one question we all need to hear. What are you avoiding? Death, discomfort, silence, being alone with your own mind. Because whatever you're avoiding, that's where the practice needs to go. The forest monks didn't meditate in charnel grounds because they enjoyed corpses. They meditated there because they needed to face what terrified them. You don't need a corpse, but you probably need to face whatever you've been running from. What's your charnel ground? In a lot of modern mindfulness culture, Buddhism becomes another form of comfort. Mindfulness as stress reduction, meditation as productivity optimization. That's not wrong. Those benefits exist, but that wasn't what the forest monks meant. They weren't trying to reduce stress, they were trying to wake up. And waking up requires looking at what you'd rather avoid. A Western monk practicing at a Thai forest monastery was once asked, "Why do you still do the charnel ground practice? We have books, teachings, all the instructions. Why do you need to sit with corpses? He answered, because reading about death is easy, thinking about death is easy, even talking about death is easy, but sitting next to a body, seeing your own body in 50 years, that changes you. And I don't want a philosophy. I want a transformation. The Thai forest tradition began over a century ago, but its question remains eternal. Let's return to where we started. A monk, a corpse, a forest clearing at midnight. In the early 1900s, Ajahn Mun walked into those forests asking, what did the Buddha actually do? In 2025, we're still asking, what does authentic practice look like? The answer hasn't changed. Look at what you avoid. Go there. Stay present. The forest tradition isn't really about forests, it's about honesty. Refusing to pretend that reading books or attending ceremonies equals transformation. Admitting I'm afraid of death, of discomfort, of my own mind. And then, instead of running, sitting down with that fear. Whether in a Thai jungle, a meditation center in Massachusetts, or a quiet room in your house, the location doesn't matter ultimately. What matters is, are you actually facing it? We've explored many Buddhist traditions on this channel. The three schools Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, Zen and its emphasis on sudden awakening, Pure Land and its path of devotion, the Tibetan Book of the Dead and its maps of the afterlife. But the forest tradition reminds us clearly, all of these are maps. The Buddha didn't become enlightened by reading maps. He sat down, under a tree, facing Mara. We've talked about him before, the mind's refusal to let go. And he refused to move until he understood. The forest monks took that seriously, maybe too seriously by contemporary standards, but maybe that seriousness is exactly what we've lost. The man who started all of this, Ajahn Mun, lived one of the most extraordinary lives in modern Buddhist history. He wandered for 50 years, claimed to perceive gods and spirits, challenged the entire Thai Buddhist establishment with his uncompromising practice. And when he died, tens of thousands came to honor a monk who'd owned nothing. His story, the practices, the visions, the controversies, the teachings, deserves its own exploration. Next time we'll meet the man who took the Buddha's path seriously enough to risk everything. Ajahn Mun, the Buddhist master who took the gods to school. Until then, consider this. Whatever your charnel ground is, go there gently and stay long enough to stop negotiating with yourself. Because in the end, that's where reality begins. If this exploration of the Thai forest tradition resonated with you, consider subscribing to Buddha's Wisdom. We explore Buddhist teachings, practices, and histories that challenge conventional understanding. Next, we dive deep into Ajahn Mun's extraordinary life, his death-defying practices, his supernatural claims, his legacy. Leave a comment below. What's your charnel ground? What have you been avoiding? Until then, stay curious, stay wise,